to address you on the state of what might be best described right now as New Zealand's Goldilocks economy, not too hot and not too cold. Please welcome Shamubeel Eaqub.
Thank you, Andrew. It's great to be here, everybody. Thank you, Tim, for the invitation to come and speak today. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on talking about the short-term implications of the economy. What I want to do today is really set the scene for the big changes that we are going to experience both in New Zealand but across the world. We're talking about an economy that's changing, society that's changing, and that has significant implications not just for what we think of as economists, but what you think of as insurers. So I'll start off by, taking us through the recession because it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience and it has changed everything. And a lot of the changes that we've been seeing in the backdrop of the economy got really crunched and sped up. And this faster change has been really, really helpful in giving us some context that the things that are driving the change in our economy, the changes in our behavior, these will continue. And this will mean really, really big changes when it comes to very different customers of the future, where they're going to be placed, what kind of businesses we're going to be insuring and working with, but most importantly, the kind of pressures we're going to see in the political system and hence the changes we will see in the institutional structures of what we operate in. So we are going to see massive changes and we are going to see the need for us to be agile and nimble to be able to address some of these things. If the AV guys could turn on the timer, I will make sure I don't go over time. So I guess the backdrop of what we're talking about today is best summed up by this quote from Harold Wilson. He who rejects change is the architect of decay. And this is something that's been really brought home to me because when we've been thinking about the economy, everything that we base our models on tend to be based on correlations and statistical measures. But everything has broken down in the last 7 years. It's broken down because we've relied too much on correlation and not enough on causation. So much of what we're seeing is about changing behavior, changing structures of the economy, that the really simplifications that we saw in our economy through our models were no longer appropriate. And that really matters because that is something that is going to be applicable not just for economists, but for everybody else. In terms of the economic backdrop, this is probably the sort of the money chart. And I'm an economist, so I'm going to show you lots of charts. This has been quite literally once in a lifetime recession. So all I'm trying to show here in the gray bar is the recoveries from recession in every recession we've had since the 1960s, and the blue line is today. And 7 years on, this recession is still smaller. Our economy is still smaller than the historical average. This recession was deeper and longer than ever before, and this recession created more economic change than any other recession than the Great Depression. You literally have to go back to the Great Depression of the 1930s to find another economic event that was this disruptive, this big, this intense. And it matters because this has crunched the experiences of what we have seen very, very rapidly. The other thing that has happened, of course, is that we had the earthquake in Canterbury. So I grew up in Canterbury, in Lincoln, which wasn't badly affected. But when you look at what has happened in Canterbury, it has changed everything that we understand about our responses to disasters and our responses to change of significant magnitudes. What we saw in the economic perspective was one of significant disruption, but also the massive cost of the rebuild and the massive dislocation. When I hear economists talk about how this recession, this earthquake rebuilding is going to add to economic growth, it makes me angry. It makes me angry because you don't break something, fix it, and call it good. Those economists should be fired immediately. But the other story that's happening elsewhere in New Zealand is one of very slow economic growth. Look at what's happening in the blue line and where we are relative to before the recession. This is the amount of concrete poured. We could have looked at anything. No. Isn't this cool? Economists get to look at how much concrete you pour in the economy. That's what turns us on. But the story of what's happening in the construction sector in terms of concrete poured, in terms of jobs, anything that you talk about, The real story here is that even though we're seeing this semblance of strong economic growth, in the backdrop is this economy that's actually still quite stagnant and not much is happening. And keep that in the back of your mind, because what we're seeing and what we're experiencing is not an aberration. This is actually a big change, something that is part of a bigger trend. And what we saw through the 2000s was the aberration, not the norm. We are in the new normal, and this is going to be a very different setting for all of us. And some of the things that we're seeing within the context of this recession is massive, massive uptake of technology. And I know it sounds surprising, but the businesses that have invested during the recession are the ones that have done well. Almost every other business has been really, really struggling. And the reason for that is the technological backdrop is changing so quickly. If you're not up to date, you're really missing out. And I saw this chart in the New York Times, and I thought it was just a beautiful application of, or illustration of how quickly our backdrop of technological change is happening. And this one just tracks the sort of uptake of technology in US consumers. We could do the same for New Zealand, but we don't have rich enough data. But essentially it shows that the landline took over 50 years to reach mass penetration, the home computer 17, the internet 13, and the smartphone 7 years. Let me just stop and ask, how many of you have a BlackBerry? You look a little bit embarrassed. You should be, because the market cap of BlackBerry was $80 billion in 2007, and today it's less than $4 billion. What's the lesson there? The rise and fall of technology is really, really fast, but even within the winning sectors, even within the winning bits of technology, the rise and fall is incredibly rapid. And this really matters because it means that for technologies, investments, the shelf life is really, really short. And the ability to keep pace is getting harder and harder. It requires constant investment and constant care to make sure you stay ahead of the curve. The other thing that's happening, and this is something that it really annoys me because people talk about it as if it's new. The story of urbanization, that we live in different places, we work in different places. This is not new. This has been happening for a very long time, and this is a trend that's not only visible in New Zealand, but across the world. The population growth of New Zealand's rural economy in the last century is, I showed you the chart already, so I shouldn't ask you the question, 0. All the population growth of New Zealand in the last century has happened in urban centers. And it's in very many different layers of urbanization, whether it's moving from the hinterland to, say, Invercargill, or going to Dunedin to study, or going to Auckland to work, or going, even indeed, to places like Sydney, Brisbane, and New York to work. And this is not surprising because what we're seeing is we're seeing this constant change. These are all continuation of similar trends, but what we continue to see is this massive changes of where we live and how we live. And this matters for a lot of us because our customers are in different places. One of the big patterns that's changing the dynamics of our economy is this changing face of globalization. Now, globalization is nothing new, but it is speeding up, and it is going to be very different in terms of what our economic makeup is going to be over the next 10, 20, 30 years. Now, I love this map, which I saw in The Economist, but it's originally from the McKinsey Global Institute. And it tells this beautiful story of how the economies of the in the world are changing in terms of their context, in terms of their standing, in terms of their prominence. In AD 1, the center of the global economy was over the Silk Road. And then you had the industrialization, the urbanization, the increasing education of the Western economies, and the center of the global economy shifted out towards the Atlantic. Since the 1960s or 70s, it's been drifting back towards the east. And they reckon, the McKinsey Institute reckons that by 2025, the center of the global economy is going to be back over China. This eastern shift is really, really critical because what we're dealing with now is the way that we do business, the people that we do business with, the way that our economy faces and orients to is going to be entirely different to our history, to our culture, and to our experience. One of the statistics that should scare you is that even though China is our top trading partner, we still teach more kids to learn Spanish than Mandarin. We give a lot of lip service to the changing nature of our trading relationships, but we need to do more to not only do the lip service, but to actually reorient ourselves to the changes that we're going to see. We've seen massive boosts and boons for our rural economy as a result of this globalization. The rising tide of China has been a huge positive for us. You think about our export market in the last 5 years. Our exports in the last 5 years have grown by $5 billion. Our exports to China have grown by $7.4 billion. I repeat, our exports to China have grown by $7.4 billion. Our total exports have grown by $5 billion. If it wasn't for China, if it wasn't for the emerging markets of Asia, our economy would be in much more trouble, and the smooth sailing that we've had in the last few years would not have been guaranteed. But neither is it guaranteed when we think about the changing nature of doing business in these places. The fact of the matter is, New Zealand is one of the easiest places to do business. In the latest survey, we came in, I think, number 3 in terms of the rank of doing business, ease of doing business. The countries that we want to deal with, the countries that we want to export to, the countries that we want capital from, they're some of the hardest places to do business in the world. How are we going to manage the risk? How are we going to change our way of doing business? Because that is going to be absolutely critical. Now, all of those things are happening not just in New Zealand, but everywhere, right across the world. What's special about us and many of the advanced economies is this is all going to be sped up by an aging population. And Natalie is going to talk about the demographic changes, and I think she's going to do a really powerful job of scaring the hell out of you guys. She certainly scares the hell out of me. Not because she's scary, but because of the message, right? She's a lovely lady. The aging story is really, really important because when we think about aging, quite often we kind of park it to the side. We think it's something that's going to happen later stages. It's not going to happen to us. It's going to happen to somebody else. Well, get real, guys. Everybody gets older. You don't need an economist to tell you that. The fact of the matter is, aging is something that's happening right now. The fastest growing age group of New Zealand is the over 65s. Aging is not an issue of the future. It's happening right now. It is going to speed up, and it is going to wreak significant changes in the way that our economy is organized, in the way that our customers are shaped, where they live, and how they operate. And that, I think, is going to be the most interesting thing in terms of the implications when we go forward. So a lot of the changes that we've talked about is we've gone through this recession that was really painful. It was actually a really interesting period because a lot of the changes got squeezed in, and we could see them in sharper relief. And the changes that we were observing are the same ones that have been in play for a long time. The forces of technological change, the forces of urbanization, the forces of globalization and aging. These are all things that will continue to have significant changes. But the first implication is that we are going to deal with entirely different economies and businesses. And this is probably one of the most powerful stories that we have seen, both across a long period of time, but of course also at a much more local level. In a very long-term perspective, the story that resonates the most with me is we think of New Zealand as a very rural economy, right? Where our backbone is the farming sector, and it must be incredibly prominent. And the fact of the matter is, it is for our exports. But when it comes to jobs, the primary sector doesn't actually employ that many people anymore. If you look at the censuses going back to 1900, we employ the same number of people in the primary sector today as we did in 1901. In 100 years, in this incredibly productive, incredibly successful sector, we have created few direct jobs. Most of the jobs have actually come for the downstream and upstream services. But it matters, right? Because it matters because our understanding of the economy is different from our perceptions of the economy. For many of these sectors, the story is very different. In 1901, a third of our jobs were in primary sectors. Today, it's less than 6%. But the story is a lot of these sectors have become incredibly more capital intensive. So their requirements in terms of how they run their businesses, what they have to ensure, and the risks that they manage are entirely different. The biggest growth is coming in places like the services sector. And this has wreaked incredible change in the electricity sector, for example. Why am I telling you this? Because forever we thought that as long as the economy was growing, electricity consumption would also rise. You've got to turn on the lights, you've got to do the stuff, right? Except in the last 7 to 9 years, there has been no growth in power consumption. Why? Because our economy is changing, and because when you're working in offices, you can cram a whole bunch of more people into it like sardines. Our office is actually quite good, but other people, probably in insurance companies, right? Because we're moving to this more office-based economy and the service-based economy, we are going to look very different. Our requirements for capital, our requirements for the risk management are going to become much more service-based, much more interruption-based, much more different than the physical world. And that matters. And we are going to see some pretty big changes coming through in terms of the businesses that are out there and the innovation and the changes we will see in it. But for me, the really important aspect is we are going to see completely different consumers going forward. And this is a really powerful force because you are going to see just different types of people when it comes to your customer base. You're seeing this already, but in reality, what we're going to see is a whole bunch of people quite flush with money because, when you're young and under 45, you've got all these other costs. And you're getting to this place where we are going to have quite a lot of our population that will be in very different stages of their lives. And you are going to have a very different risk profile because the customers will look different. They are going to do different things, and they're going to operate very differently. And they're going to live in very different places. Now, I have to kind of show you a few regional stories because, I wrote a book about regions recently. I called some places zombie towns. I'm not welcome in Wanganui anymore. Is anybody from Wanganui? Nobody admits to it. I'm sorry if you are. But the story about this regional thing is, if you look at what's happening in terms of population growth, in terms of where people live and how people choose to live, it is changing quite a bit. And not all of it is entirely predictable. So on the left-hand map, you can see what was happening in terms of population growth in the 2006 census. And you'll see all the red bits, which is kind of the declines in population. And on the right-hand side, you'll see what's happening in terms of population declines in the 2013 census. So if you look at the North Island, the story is very clear. The cancer is spreading. There are more places that are facing declining population, and they will have an entirely new set of problems compared to other places. But if you look at what's happened right down the bottom of the country, Southland has gone from decline to actual modest growth. And that is really interesting because what we're seeing is that you can't just rely on the old patterns of growth. You need to think about what's actually happening in these very local places. In places like Southland, that very strong economy, particularly through the boom in the dairy sector, has created this massive demand for people to come in. So it's been filled by immigration and population has actually grown. And it matters because all of a sudden we are seeing these very different patterns of population growth, where people choose to live and how people choose to live is going to be a really critical part. The other thing that we're seeing, of course, is this massive changes in living arrangements. We are living completely different. Our households are going to look different. Our customers are going to look very different. Now, this census has been this absolute treasure trove. Now, I don't know about you guys, but the census is kind of like, fantastic for economists. We had been sort of gagging for it because it was delayed by the earthquakes in Canterbury. And the thing that it came through is that because of those extra couple of years, we actually saw even bigger changes than we expected. And one of them has been this one, in terms of where the growth in households have been, mostly one-person and two-person households, versus what kind of houses we're building. Pretty much most of the houses we build in New Zealand are 4-bedroom plus. Most of the households that are being formed in New Zealand are 1 or 2 people households. A lot of lonely old people in places like Gisborne. I'm insulting lots of different places today. Edit that bit out. But this living differently stuff is really important because we are going to see this massive mismatches in the portfolio of assets that we have and the customers that we have. And this is going to create some big management issues in terms of how do we transition into the right ways of living? Are we overcapitalized in terms of our assets, our housing, and all those bits and pieces? And I'm really concerned that these issues are much more prominent in provincial centres where house prices have fallen a lot. I don't know if you saw the Herald today, but they had this, on the second page, they had this beautiful map of house price changes compared to, I think, 6 or 7 years ago. And the story is very clear. House prices have risen in Auckland and Canterbury, but in pretty much every other part of New Zealand, house prices are down significantly. So are we going to be able to see these people transition into different houses, into different ways of living? I don't know. One of the things that we always find that's really interesting is people think that, because you're going to be 65, you're going to be like the 65-year-olds we serviced last week, right? That's so not true. Every generation is different. And the exciting thing that's going to be about this bulge of aging that we're seeing with the baby boomers, this has been the most revolutionary generation that we've seen of any. And even without those guys, what we've already seen in the last 10 years, last 20 years, is this massive changes in the way that older people behave. And what we've seen is that, for example, people are spending a lot more money on running their house, on their health and food. And within food, there's some really beautiful stories. When you chuck into, really delve into the data, people are spending more money on fruit and vegetables. They're being really, really healthy. And guess what they're spending more money on? Wine. They're having fun as well. So it's really interesting to see these changing patterns of consumption, because what we're seeing is this really different patterns of different generations. Even by age group, you can't hold it constant. There is no such thing as this one group of people who are old. We are looking at very different patterns of consumption across different generations, and they are going to set very different types of demand going forward. And to me, this is exciting, but at the same time really risky, because it means that the consumers and the customers that we're servicing look different, behave different, want different things. Now, my parents are a very good example. So they're generally technology, challenged. And I got them an iPad. And I thought, they'll be okay with it. After about 10 days, they were fighting over the iPad, so I had to get them another one. But now my dad refuses to call the insurance company or anybody else. He wants to do everything via email and live chat and all these other things. 2 years ago, he wouldn't have done that. But technology and these different generations are adopting them at very different rates, whereas my grandmother wouldn't, and I'm sure you guys have the same stories. So we are seeing these big generational differences that are having massive impacts in terms of how we think about our economy. Now, two final things that are going to be really, really important and sources of massive opportunity. First one is going to be the pressures on the fiscal side. So this aging story, the changing economy, all of this is going to mean one thing and one thing only. The promises that governments have made in the past cannot be sustained, will not be sustained, and they will change. Government is not going to be the backstop for everything because they simply will not have the money to do so. The biggest pressures are going to be coming from super and from health. Those are the sort of big costs of aging. And this means that we are going to have some seriously big rethinks in terms of our natural disaster funding, our EQC, all of those kinds of things. And we've been far too slow in thinking about those issues because we are not going to have the balance sheet capacity to deal with the kind of shocks we had with Canterbury if we don't change some of the big issues around health and aging. So these big changes that are not necessarily directly relevant for industry are absolutely critical because we have relied for very long on the resilience of the central government balance sheet to get us through. The other thing that the earthquake has revealed is that the local government sector is going to face significant pressures in the next 50 years. This is some work that we did for the Office of the Auditor General. The report is coming out soon. But essentially what it shows is the 100-year pattern of investment in local government infrastructure. You'll see that with roads and other, which is mainly through the three waters, we went through these massive cycles of investment. And there were two big surges of investment, once in the 30s and once in the 50s, 60s, and sort of ending in the late 60s. These are coming up for renewal, and we don't have the money to pay for it. In the local government sector, we've got massive amounts of assets which need to be renewed, but we can't renew them. The fiscal pressures that we see in the central government sector is only the tip of the iceberg. In the local government sector, the pressure is going to be far more intense and far bigger. We're going to see massive changes in terms of what kind of infrastructure we have in the local government sector, how we manage the risks in the local government sector, and what rules and regulations we might put in place to manage risk more generally in those local areas. This is going to be a really big issue. This is something that everybody is grappling with, but I don't think there are any easy answers. So where does that leave us? I think the story that I'm trying to tell you is a very simple one. It's a very simple story in terms of sped up change. I tried to show you that this recession, this current period in our economy is entirely different from any other that we have experienced before. Don't rely on the rules of thumbs that worked in previous recoveries because they won't work. It is not like every other recovery. It's like the recession of the Great Depression. We are in for a very different type of economic backdrop for the next little while. But more importantly, when we're thinking about what happened in that period, it was about speed of change. Things got much faster. They weren't new things, it was the same things that have been driving our economy forward for a very long time. Technological change, urbanization, globalization, aging. These are going to lead to significant differences in how we live, what customers you have, where they live, what sort of businesses we're dealing with, but most importantly, the institutional pressures and settings that we will see, because both central government and local government are going to face massive pressures because we haven't prepared ourselves, we haven't managed the risks that we know are there. That creates risks, but at the same time, we know that on the flip side of every risk is an opportunity, and hopefully that gives you guys a little bit of context of where we are and a bit of context for the rest of the day. Thank you.
Excellent, Shamubeel. You never let us down. Shamubeel and I have done a couple of presentations together around the country as part of a MediaWorks series, so had a chance to see, and it always brings great clarity to a debate that can often be very confusing. So questions, we've got about 10 minutes. You can all become economists now, ask those challenging questions, particularly as they relate to your sectors, your respective areas of interest. Does anybody have a particular question to kick us off? Otherwise, don't all rush. This is top man, let me assure you. Right, here's one for you, Shamubeel. Do you believe, or what do you believe is going to define successful economies in this post-GFC environment? Where does the focus need to be?
So, success is such a difficult thing to define. I think one of the most critical mistakes that we've made over the last 20 years is we've put a lot of focus on growth rather than on prosperity. And they are slightly different things. And the reason they're different is when you think about growth, you think about the aggregate and you forget the underlying issues of equity. And one of the things that has become absolutely clear over this course of this recession is that the people who suffered during the recession are not the same people who benefited from the recovery. And we're seeing this massive gap opening up between the haves and have-nots, and it is not going to change without a much more empathetic view towards business and through policymaking. So I think for me, success is about equity, it's about prosperity, and the one that's shared rather than this view of aggregate, average, total.
So what's the biggest issue that the insurance sector should be thinking about, do you believe? I mean, you highlighted several in your presentation, but where do you think is the biggest, or needs to be the biggest focus right now?
I think one of the most long-term sort of focuses needs to be around where do people choose to live, and are they thinking about the issues properly. So when I think about the very long-term risks around climate change, around erosion, around natural hazards, which New Zealand is really prone to, I think that is an area where the insurance sector can have a really big influence by setting the price signals and being able to work collaboratively with central and local government to set the direction for managing those risks without being, I guess, too heavy-handed.
We're going to have, according to some of those figures you showed, a real problem with many local governments being able to sustain, I guess, infrastructure and development that they have in the past. So that's going to create some pain points, obviously, down the track.
It's going to create some big challenges, but at the same time, we will have to innovate to do something differently. And the ones that innovate, so for a lot of small towns, they've got the ability to move from reticulation to distributed networks, so having your own rainwater and all that kind of stuff. So those things are possible, but you have to make sure that you're able to manage those risks. And we are going to see demand that's going to be different. But at the same time, we are going to see some small places that are just going to be crushed under the weight of the cost of maintaining the services.
I had a great guest on the program last week, IVHQ, 29-year-old, who has set up a business that creates volunteer experiences around the world. It's all based in New Plymouth. He employs about 24 people. He's 29 years of age. 40,000 clients have gone through his business in the last 7 years. And interestingly enough, 75% of his clients come from the United States. Less than 1% of his clients come from New Zealand. If we could have more of that within the regions, it might create a different story down the track. Is that going to happen, do you think? Are we going to see technology driving some opportunities perhaps for the regions?
I hope we do, but I'm not confident that we will. So when I hear about these superstars, they really are superstars. You've got these incredible individuals with entrepreneurship and zeal that are able to make these things happen. So I don't think it's about the technology. Ultimately, the success of that person is much more about him. And so I hope that we can replicate more of this. I hope we can get more entrepreneurship. But the reality is that we are going to see more people moving into cities. The urbanization trend isn't going to stop. And technology actually favors more people to live closer together. Because if you think about your Facebook network, it's pretty much people you know, right? And people you see all the time. And you like each other coffees while you're having it together. And so, a lot of technology is about strengthening the bonds that you already have rather than creating new markets. So I'm, cautiously hopeful, but I think that is not going to be the big driver of regional prosperity.
Okay. Anybody else want to dive in? Yes.
Hi, you talked about the globalization of China in 2025. Just a quick question. On the ghost towns of China, there are ghost towns in China. I just want to know the influence on the New Zealand economy when that bubble breaks, when the ghost towns of China no longer, and the investments that have been put in there, and that bubble breaks, and the investors who invested in the ghost towns, what will the influence be on the New Zealand economy?
So the China story is a really interesting one. There are two things that are going on. One is the structural increase of China, and the other one is the cyclical bubble that they've got in their property sector. And you probably need to separate those two things out. One is there is this urbanization, people getting more educated, still more people joining the ranks of middle classes that will continue to place some kind of demand, some kind of floor in demand for some time to come. But we've never experienced another economy which has grown in an uninterrupted way like China for such a long period of time. They're due some kind of hiccup. So even if that happens, it doesn't mean that our connections to China become obsolete. But the story about the shifting of globalization, the eastward shift of the center of the global economy is not just about China. It's about the rise of middle classes more generally right through Asia. And so we are talking about this almost 50-year trend, 100-year trend of structural change that's going to create significant opportunities. So yes, we're going to have hiccups. It is going to have implications. And what we're seeing in terms of dairy prices, down 50% since February, what we're seeing in terms of forestry exports are exactly what you'd expect to see when demand suddenly dries up from your biggest market. And it hurts. It is going to be painful. But the longer-term picture for me in Asia is still incredibly positive beyond these hiccups.
I actually wonder if the issues around Europe are potentially greater than the ghost cities around China. If you look at sort of the situation in countries like Italy, France at the moment, I mean, it was a staggering statistic out of The Spectator the other day. If you saw this, the parliamentarian hairstylist in the Italian parliament gets paid €160,000 a year. Imagine the reaction in this country if John Key had a personal hairstylist that was being paid 165,000 New Zealand dollars a year. Extraordinary, the waste that's going on within those economies. Is that going to potentially be a...
Europe is a pretty big risk for us, and the reason for that is twofold. One is it is such a big part of our exports, such a large part of our connections into Europe through capital flows, trade flows, you name it. The second risk is, of course, that they are probably in for a very long stagnation. The kinds of things you're talking about are endemic through their economy, probably not in the same extent, but the Europe is still a very it's a slow, old-fashioned economy, and it's got lots of issues around vulnerable banks and profligate governments, and that has big implications. So it means that they are probably in a period of long stagnation like Japan has been for the last 20 or 30 years. So I don't think we are going to see the European market recovering suddenly and giving us that opportunity to keep re-exporting. So we need to be again, it's that sort of that constant change story that we'll have to constantly reinvent our customers, re-engage with the customers, and think about where we go next. And that's why I sort of ended with this quote from Sun Tzu, that it's not about trying to hold on to what you've got. You have to attack the new opportunities that are coming. You have to keep changing, because if you can't, you're going to be steamrolled by the changes that are coming.